Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I'm a geologist in Antarctica. We drilled into the ice and found a passageway to something ancient and alive. I didn't sign up for this. I mean, sure, I knew Antarctica wasn't exactly going to be a vacation. When I took the job as a geologist with a private research team, I figured I'd be studying core samples, analysing ice strata, and dealing with temperatures so cold they'd make your teeth ache. And that's how it was, for the first few weeks anyway. But things changed when we moved to the second drill site. Our team was stationed at a remote outpost, miles away from any other human beings. Just us, the ice, and an endless expanse of white. The kind of isolation that makes you feel like you're at the edge of the world. The second site wasn't like the others. For one, the ice there was strange, denser, almost crystalline, and riddled with fractures that didn't seem natural. But what really stood out was the temperature. It was warmer. Not warm by any normal standard. It was still well below freezing, but significantly warmer than it should have been for that depth. Like something below the ice was generating heat. We should have stopped there. It started with the drilling. The plan was straightforward. Drill a core sample from the deeper layers and analyze it for any signs of ancient life or geological anomalies. But as soon as we started drilling, the equipment began acting up. The drill would stop suddenly, like it had hit something harder than the ice. When we pulled it back up, the bits weren't worn down or damaged. They were clean, almost too clean. By the third day, we'd only made it half as far as we should have, and then, around midnight, we broke through. I was asleep in the base camp when the alarm went off. At first, I thought it was a malfunction. It wasn't uncommon for the equipment to glitch in the cold, and I was used to ignoring the blaring alerts until someone on the tech team sorted it out. But this time was different. The alarm wasn't stopping, and the ground beneath the base was vibrating faintly. A low rhythmic hum echoed through the walls, almost like a pulse. I threw on my boots and parka and headed out to the drill site where the rest of the team was already gathered. The air was heavy, colder than usual, and the sky was eerily clear, the stars looking sharper than they ever had before. The drill was silent now, its lights flickering like a dying flashlight. Our lead engineer, Davis, was hunched over the control panel, muttering to himself. "What's going on?" I asked, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "We hit something," he said, his voice tight. "What do you mean something? Like rock?" He shook his head and pointed to the monitor. The feed from the drill's camera was displayed there, a grainy, black and white image of a hole. It was perfectly round, like it had been carved by something precise. The edges were smooth, almost polished, and the walls glistened faintly as if they were wet. "We're over 300 meters down," Davis said. "There shouldn't be a cavity like this. Not naturally." The rest of the team stood in tense silence, watching the monitor. The hum was louder now, almost imperceptibly vibrating through the air. And then the camera feed flickered. For a moment, the screen went black, and when it came back, there was something else on the monitor. A shadow. It was faint, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness, but it was there, moving. "Is that a trick of the light?" one of the techs muttered. "No," Davis said. His hands were trembling as he typed something into the controls. The camera feed zoomed in, and we all leaned closer. The shadow wasn't a trick of the light. It was alive. At that point, I wanted to call it. Whatever we'd found, it wasn't something we were equipped to deal with. But Davis insisted on lowering the probe. The probe was a small, remote-controlled device equipped with lights and a claw arm for collecting samples. It descended into the hole slowly, the camera feed flickering with static as it went deeper. The hum grew louder. We watched in tense silence as the probe entered the cavity. The space was massive, far larger than we'd expected, with walls that sparkled like crystal. But it wasn't just the walls that caught our attention. There were shapes embedded in the ice. At first, I thought they were just rocks, but as the probe's light swept over them, I realized they were something else entirely. They were structures. The formations were angular, symmetrical, almost like buildings. They didn't look human, though. The angles were too sharp, the proportions too strange. And then the probe's light caught something else. A hand. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of a human hand, and encased in the ice. The fingers were long and thin, ending in sharp, claw-like tips. The ice around the hand was different, clearer, almost like glass. And as the probe moved closer, I thought I saw it twitch. "Get it out of there," I said, my voice breaking the silence. Davis ignored me, his eyes locked on the monitor. "Davis," I said, louder this time. "Pull it back. Now." He hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls, and then the camera feed cut out completely. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. We all stood there, staring at the blank monitor, waiting for something to happen. And then we heard it. A deep, resonant sound, like the groan of shifting ice, echoed up from the hole. It wasn't natural, it wasn't wind or the shifting of the glacier. It was deliberate, and it was getting louder. I don't remember running back to the base camp, but somehow I ended up there. The rest of the team followed, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us, as if that would stop whatever was out there. For hours, we sat in silence, listening to the sound outside. It wasn't just the groaning anymore. It was something else, something moving. I don't know what we unleashed down there, but I know one thing for sure. It's alive, and it's awake. The sound outside didn't stop. It started as a low groan, like ice shifting under pressure, but it didn't stay that way. It grew louder, deeper, and more rhythmic, like something enormous was moving beneath us. Inside the base, none of us said a word. We just sat there, staring at each other, waiting for someone, anyone, to suggest what to do next. But no one did. I think we all knew there wasn't anything we could do. Around 2 a.m., Davis broke the silence. "We need to retrieve the probe." His voice was calm, but his hands were trembling. "You can't be serious," I said. "Did you not hear what's happening out there?" He looked at me, his eyes wide and frantic. "That equipment isn't cheap. We can't just leave it down there." "Forget the probe," one of the techs snapped. "There's something alive in that hole. You saw it, just like the rest of us." "That's exactly why we can't leave it," Davis argued. "Do you realize what this could mean? This is bigger than us, bigger than this project. If we found evidence of life, evidence," I cut him off. "That thing in the ice wasn't evidence. It was moving, it touched the probe." Davis didn't reply. He just stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, and then the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was a power surge, something common in conditions like this. But then the sound changed. It wasn't just groaning anymore, it was scraping. It was faint at first, like nails on glass, but it got louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the direction of the drill site. Something was climbing. One of the techs ran to the window, pulling back the thick thermal curtains just enough to peek outside. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What is it?" I asked, my chest tightening. He didn't answer. I joined him, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The ground around the drill site wasn't solid anymore. It was rippling, shifting, as if something beneath the ice was trying to break through. And then I saw the first crack. It started small, just a thin line spidering out from the hole, but it grew fast, splitting the ice like a broken windshield. The sound of it was deafening, a sharp, piercing crack that echoed through the frozen landscape. The tech beside me stumbled back, muttering, "This isn't happening! This isn't real!" But it was. The cracks widened, and something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shape, a dark, massive shadow rising out of the hole. But as it moved into the dim light of the outpost's floodlights, I saw it more clearly. It was covered in ice, its body jagged and glistening like a glacier come to life. It moved slowly, deliberately, its limbs impossibly long and thin, bending in ways that didn't make sense. And then it turned toward us. Even through the thick windows, I felt its presence, like the air in the room had been sucked out. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, except for two glowing, faintly blue orbs, where its eyes should have been. They pulsed in and out like breathing. One of the floodlights flickered and went out, plunging part of the drill site into darkness. The thing didn't seem to notice. It was too focused on us. "Everyone away from the windows!" Davis shouted, snapping us out of our daze. We scrambled to the far side of the room, huddling together like kids hiding from a monster under the bed. "What the hell is it?" someone whispered. "Does it matter?" another replied, their voice shaking. The scraping sound started again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. I don't know how it got in. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, but the sound was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, and getting closer. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. "It's here," Davis whispered, his face pale. "Don't say that," I hissed. "Don't." The lights went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and the scraping stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears like a drum. Then the humming returned. It was louder now, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my chest. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a feeling, like the air itself was alive. And then, in the darkness, I saw them. The eyes. They were everywhere, glowing faintly in the pitch-black room. Dozens of them, maybe more, watching us from every corner, every shadow. No one moved. No one even breathed. And then, one by one, they blinked out, disappearing into the void. The humming stopped, and the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in stunned silence. "What the hell just happened?" one of the techs finally asked. "I don't know," I admitted. My voice was barely a whisper. But I think we woke something up. Davis didn't say anything. He just sat down on the floor, his head in his hands. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to leave, now." "No," Davis muttered. He looked up, his eyes wide and frantic. "We can't leave. Don't you get it? It's not just here, it's everywhere." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. We hadn't just found something ancient beneath the ice, we'd unleashed it. The silence after Davis's words felt heavier than the cold outside. We couldn't stay. That much was clear. But where could we go? The outpost was isolated, miles away from any other station, and the storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days was finally rolling in. The winds were already starting to howl, rattling the walls, like they might collapse at any moment. The rest of the team looked to me as if I had answers. I didn't. The only thing I knew for certain was that whatever we'd unleashed wasn't going back into that hole. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We pack the essentials, radio for help, and head to the secondary outpost." Davis shook his head. "The radios won't work. Not now." "What do you mean?" "They've been interfering since the drill hit that cavity," he said, his voice rising. "The signals. Don't you hear it? That hum. It's everywhere now." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I already knew he was right. The radios had been acting up for days, cutting in and out with bursts of static and strange tones. Still, I had to try. The communications room was at the far end of the base, down a long, narrow corridor. The lights flickered as I made my way there, each buzz of the fluorescent bulbs sending shivers down my spine. When I stepped inside, I hesitated. The room felt wrong. It was too quiet. The hum that had filled the air moments ago completely gone. The radio equipment sat on the desk, the usual lights and dials dark. I reached out, my fingers brushing the power switch, and the moment I turned it on, the hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the floor. The static on the radio crackled to life, and a voice broke through. "Don't leave!" I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, distorted, like a chorus of whispers all speaking at once. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The static hissed, and the voice spoke again. "We are awake!" I slammed the radio off and bolted back to the common room, my pulse racing. "We have to go," I said, my words spilling out in a rush. "We have to go now!" "What happened?" one of the techs asked, her face pale. I hesitated, glancing at Davis. He was sitting on the floor, staring at nothing, his lips moving silently. "They're in the radios," I said. "Maybe more. I don't know. But they're awake, and they don't want us to leave." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. We gathered what we could: emergency supplies, clothing, and the backup generator in case the snowcats failed. The storm was coming fast, but staying wasn't an option, and then we heard it. The scratching. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it was coming from all around us. Walls, floors, ceilings. The sound of something clawing its way through the structure. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. "It's them," Davis said, his voice eerily calm. He stood, his eyes glassy, like he wasn't fully there. "They're inside. They've always been inside." Before any of us could stop him, he walked to the nearest window and pulled back the curtain. We didn't see the storm outside. We saw eyes, hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the swirling snow, watching from the darkness. They were everywhere, surrounding the outpost, their shapes just barely visible through the frost-covered glass. "Don't look at them!" I shouted, pulling Davis away from the window. But it was too late. He was mumbling again, the same words over and over. "They're inside. They're inside." His voice grew louder, almost frantic, and then he stopped. He turned to me, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. "They're in me." The lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Davis was gone. The window was open, frost creeping along the edges where the glass had been pushed aside. We didn't have time to process what had just happened. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then the walls began to shake. We bolted for the snowcats, the storm hitting us the moment we stepped outside. The wind was blinding, stinging my face like shards of glass. The snowcats were barely visible through the whiteout, their outlines distorted by the swirling frost. As we ran, I glanced back at the outpost. The lights inside were still flickering, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, figures shifting behind the windows, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. We piled into the snowcats, slamming the doors shut and starting the engines. The machines roared to life, their headlights cutting through the storm, and we took off toward the secondary outpost. The storm swallowed us whole, the wind howling like a living thing, but we didn't stop. And then the hum returned. It wasn't coming from the radios this time. It was coming from the ice itself, vibrating through the ground and into the vehicles. The snowcat in front of us suddenly skidded to a stop. "What's going on?" I shouted into the comms, but the only response was static. The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath us began to crack. I'll never forget what happened next. The ice in front of the lead snowcat split open, and something massive rose from the depths. It wasn't like the creature we'd seen at the drill site. This was bigger, its form shifting and twisting like liquid, its surface glistening with frost. It moved too fast for something its size, slamming into the snowcat and dragging it into the darkness below. Our vehicle skidded to a stop, the driver shouting something I couldn't hear over the roar of the storm. The cracks in the ice were spreading, chasing us like veins of lightning, and I knew we didn't have much time. "Drive!" I screamed. The snowcat roared forward, narrowly avoiding a fissure that opened beneath our treads. Behind us, the hum reached a deafening pitch, and I glanced back just in time to see the outpost collapse into the ice, swallowed whole by the ancient thing we'd awakened. We reached the secondary outpost hours later, battered and freezing but alive. The radios still didn't work, and in the distance, through the howling wind, I could still hear the hum. They're awake now, and they're not going back to sleep. When we reached the secondary outpost, none of us spoke. The silence wasn't relief, it was shock. We'd just seen the impossible, and worse, we knew it wasn't over. The storm outside was relentless, slamming against the walls with a force that made the outpost shudder. Inside, the heaters groaned, struggling against the cold. I sat near one of the windows, staring out into the white abyss. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, even though the room was warm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Davis, his blank expression, his voice echoing, "They're in me." "What now?" one of the techs finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. The secondary outpost was smaller than the main one, just a single room with basic equipment and a cramped sleeping area. The radio was there too, but it was dead, just like the ones at the main site. We couldn't call for help. One of the techs, Larson, was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. I could tell he was trying to hold it together, but none of us were doing much better. "It's not just the ice," he said, his voice frantic. "It's the air. It's everywhere. Don't you feel it?" I did. The hum was still there, faint but constant, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through us. "What do they want?" someone asked. Larson stopped pacing and stared at the ground. "I don't think it's about what they want. I think it's about what we've done. We woke them up, and now they're spreading. We tried to come up with a plan, but every idea seemed more hopeless than the last. We couldn't leave. The storm was too strong, and the snowcats wouldn't survive another trip. We couldn't stay either, not with the hum growing louder by the minute. And then the lights flickered. It started with the bulbs. The faint buzzing grew erratic, and the room dimmed for a few seconds before the power returned. "It's the generator," one of the techs said, already heading for the maintenance closet. "I'll check it." He was gone for less than 5 minutes. When he came back, he wasn't alone. At first, we didn't notice anything was wrong. He walked in slowly, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his face pale but calm. "Generator's fine," he said, his voice flat. "Just a small glitch." I nodded, turning back to the others. "We need to conserve power, shut down anything unnecessary." Then I noticed the blood on his boots. "Are you okay?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. He didn't respond. The others were starting to notice too, their gazes darting between him and the dark red streaks trailing behind him. "Where's the blood from?" I asked again, my voice sharper. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and then he smiled. The smile wasn't right. It was too wide, too forced, like his face was being stretched by invisible strings. "They're here," he said, his voice layered, distorted. Before anyone could react, he collapsed. His body hit the floor hard, convulsing violently. We rushed to him, but the moment we touched him, the hum surged, louder than it had ever been, rattling the walls and making the lights flicker again. And then the screaming started. It wasn't him. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air itself. A chorus of voices, all wailing in unison, their cries echoing in my skull. We backed away as his body went still, the hum dropping into an eerie silence. Then he opened his eyes. They weren't human anymore. The blue glow I'd seen in the creature's eyes back at the main site was there now, faint but unmistakable. "They're inside," he said, his voice distant and mechanical. "You'll hear them too soon." He stood slowly, his movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. "Get back," I shouted, but he didn't stop. He took a step toward us, then another. I grabbed the nearest object, a wrench from the maintenance rack, and swung it as hard as I could. The impact sent him crashing to the floor, but he didn't cry out or bleed. He just lay there twitching as the hum returned, louder and more insistent. "We have to leave," Larson said, his voice shaking. "Now." We gathered our things again, ignoring the storm outside. It didn't matter anymore. Staying meant death, or worse. The hum followed us as we stepped into the blizzard, our faces stinging from the icy wind. We trudged through the snow, the glow of the outpost fading behind us, heading toward a ridge we'd seen on the maps. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only direction we had. The storm swallowed everything. The only sound was the howling wind, broken by the occasional crack of ice beneath our boots. And then we heard them. The voices started faint, carried on the wind like whispers. "Come back. Don't leave. They're waiting." I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just swirling snow and darkness. "Keep moving," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm. But the whispers grew louder, turning into screams that didn't seem possible in the cold, thin air. One of the techs stumbled, collapsing into the snow. "We have to stop," Larson said, pulling her back to her feet. "No," I said firmly. "If we stop, we die." But as I turned back to face the ridge, I froze. There were eyes in the storm. They surrounded us, faint and glowing, just like before. But this time, they weren't stationary. They were moving, circling, closing in. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ice, and the ground beneath us began to crack again. I grabbed Larson's arm, pulling him forward. "Run!" We bolted toward the ridge, the snow shifting and crumbling beneath our feet. The screams followed us, echoing in my head, until I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my mind. And then, just as we reached the base of the ridge, the ice gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness. The last thing I saw was the glowing eyes staring down at me from the edge of the abyss. And then everything went black. I woke up in darkness. The air was heavy, damp, and bitterly cold. My entire body ached, and my head throbbed with every beat of my heart. I tried to move, but the ground beneath me was slick and uneven, and my limbs felt like lead. It took a moment for the memories to come back. The storm, the ridge, the fall, and the eyes. I wasn't alone. The faint hum I'd grown to dread was still there, vibrating through the ground, low and constant. It was softer now, almost gentle, like it was lulling me deeper into the ice. My breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as I forced myself to sit up. The space around me was vast, the walls shimmering faintly with an otherworldly light. It wasn't a natural cave. The walls were too smooth, the angles too precise. Strange symbols were etched into the ice, glowing faintly with a pale blue light that pulsed in time with the hum. I wasn't in a fissure. I was in something. "Larson," I called out, my voice echoing in the cavern. Nothing. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the wall for support. The ice was warm to the touch, which made no sense at all. "Larson!" I called again, louder this time. The echo carried back to me, distorted and wrong, as if it wasn't just bouncing off the walls but being spoken by something else. I took a step forward, my boots crunching against the ice, and that's when I saw it. A figure was standing at the far end of the cavern, barely visible in the faint light. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch and shift as I watched. Its head tilted toward me, its glowing eyes burning into mine. It didn't move. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. Then, from somewhere deeper in the cavern, I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a chorus. "You shouldn't have come." The figure moved then, gliding across the ice with a grace that defied its size. I stumbled back, slipping on the slick ground, and fell hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me. but I scrambled to my feet as the figure loomed closer. It didn't lunge or attack. It just stood there, its presence overwhelming, filling the space with an oppressive weight. And then it spoke, not with words, but with thoughts, images, feelings. I saw flashes of something ancient, structures rising from the ice, their sharp angles and glowing symbols pulsing with life. I saw figures like the one before me, moving through the frozen landscape, their forms shifting and shimmering like mirages. And then I saw fire. The structures collapsed, consumed by an explosion of light and heat, their fragments sinking into the ice. And the voices, the hum, screamed in agony as they were entombed. The images stopped, and I was back in the cavern, gasping for breath. They were trapped, I muttered to myself, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. We woke them up. The figure tilted its head again, as if acknowledging my thoughts. "We warned you!" The chorus echoed through the cavern. "But you did not listen." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, desperate for some way out, some way to fix what we'd done. "What do you want?" I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing something behind it. A doorway. The doorway wasn't like the rest of the cavern. It was darker, its edges shimmering with a faint, almost imperceptible distortion. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay away. But the hum grew louder, pulling me toward it like a magnet. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing in front of the threshold. The air beyond it was colder, emptier, as if it led to somewhere that shouldn't exist. And then I heard the voices again. "Come." I don't know why I stepped through. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was because I knew I didn't have a choice. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world changed. I was no longer in the cavern. I was standing in an endless expanse of ice, the horizon stretching into infinity. The sky above me was dark, filled with swirling, unnatural colours that shifted and pulsed in time with the hum. And all around me were the figures, hundreds of them, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, their forms rippling like shadows on water. They didn't move, they just watched. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My breath hung in the air, frozen in place, as the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The figures began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate, their presence overwhelming. And then, in unison, they spoke. "You are one of us now." I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was back on the surface, lying in the snow near the remnants of the secondary outpost. The storm had passed, and the landscape was eerily quiet. The others were gone. I tried to call for help, but the radios were still dead. The snowcat was gone, and there was no sign of the ridge or the cavern. The only thing left was the hum. I've been walking for days now, but I'm not sure where I'm going. The hum is still with me, vibrating through my bones, growing louder with every step. Sometimes, when I look at the horizon, I see the glowing eyes watching me from the distance. They're waiting. And I know I can't escape, because now I'm one of them. I'm a mortician. Lately, the bodies brought to me are whispering secrets they shouldn't know about my life. Being a mortician isn't as creepy as people think. Sure, I deal with death every day, but after a while, it stops feeling personal. The bodies are just bodies. They don't stare back at you, they don't ask questions, and they definitely don't talk. At least, they didn't. I work in a small-town funeral home, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the same families cycle through every couple of decades. Most of the time, it's peaceful, quiet music, embalming fluid, and the occasional faint smell of flowers that never seems to leave the walls. But a couple of weeks ago, things started to change. The first time it happened, I was working late. We'd gotten a call earlier that day about a body being transferred from a hospital in the next town over. car accident, mid-30s, male. Nothing out of the ordinary. The coroner had already done their job, so all I had to do was clean him up and prep him for viewing. I was alone in the prep room, humming some tune I'd heard on the radio, when it happened. I was leaning over the body, adjusting the light when I heard it. A faint whisper. It wasn't a word, not really. More like a soft exhale, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I froze, my hands still gripping the edge of the table. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. I immediately felt stupid. It was late, and I was tired. I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time clearer. "Why didn't you tell her?" I backed up so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. The voice wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from the body. The dead man, whose name I hadn't even bothered to learn yet. I stared at his face, pale and waxy under the fluorescent light. His lips hadn't moved. His chest was still. But I knew what I'd heard. "Tell who?" I whispered, my own voice trembling. Silence. I waited, heart pounding, but the room was still again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been nothing. The hum of the air conditioning, a creak in the building, my overtired brain filling in the blanks. I finished the prep and went home, trying not to think about how my hands had been shaking the entire drive back. The next day, I got another call. This one was a woman in her 70s, a long-time resident of the town. Natural causes, no surprises. By then, I'd almost forgotten about the whisper. Almost. She arrived in the afternoon and I set to work immediately. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, her hands clasped in a way that made it look like she'd been at peace when she went. I just started applying makeup to her face when the whisper came again. This time, it was louder. "You're not as alone as you think." I dropped the brush, the clatter echoing in the empty room. My head snapped up, and I stared at her face, my pulse racing. Her lips were as still as stone, her eyes closed, but I swear I felt the air around me shift, like the room itself had leaned closer. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. Silence again. I wanted to bolt, to leave the body as it was and run out the door, but I couldn't. Not because of professionalism, but because my legs wouldn't move. Something kept me rooted to the spot, a sinking dread in my gut that I couldn't shake. Then her lips twitched. It was the smallest movement, so quick I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I grabbed my tools and finished the job as fast as I could, avoiding her face the entire time. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, staring at the shadows in the corners, jumping at every little creak and groan of the house. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, lack of sleep, maybe even a prank someone was playing on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The voices weren't random. They weren't just whispers. They were specific. That first body, talking about telling her. The second, saying I wasn't alone. It felt like they were talking to me. The thought chilled me to my core. The next day, I decided to tell my co-worker, Sam. Sam was the closest thing I had to a friend in this job, an older guy who'd been working at the funeral home for decades. He'd seen it all, or so he claimed. I waited until we were alone in the break room, sipping coffee and pretending like my hands weren't still shaking. "Sam," I started, trying to sound casual. "Have you ever, heard anything weird in the prep room?" He raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" "You know, like voices," he laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Voices? You mean the dead talking to you?" I forced a weak smile. "Something like that." Sam leaned back in his chair, the humour fading from his face. "Let me give you some advice, kid. If you ever think you hear something in there, ignore it. Don't talk to it. Don't acknowledge it. Just finish your work and get out." The seriousness in his voice sent a chill down my spine. "So, you have heard something?" He didn't answer. He just stood, poured himself another cup of coffee, and left the room. That evening, I was alone in the prep room again. Another call had come in, another body to prepare. This one was a man in his late 50s. Heart attack. I kept the radio on this time, the low hum of music filling the silence as I worked. Everything was fine until I turned to grab the embalming fluid. When I looked back, the body was staring at me. His eyes, which I'd closed myself, were open. They were cloudy, lifeless, but they were looking right at me. My entire body locked up, every hair on my neck standing on end. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. Then his mouth opened. "You're next." I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat had closed up. My breath caught somewhere in my chest. I just stood there, frozen, as his lips moved again, forming the words slower this time, as if to make sure I understood. "You're next." The radio cut out, plunging the room into silence. The fluorescent lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought they might go out completely. I stumbled back, knocking over a tray of tools, the crash jolting me into motion. Without thinking, I bolted for the door and didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air burning my lungs. When I finally looked back, the funeral home was dark, the windows blank and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows inside. I called in sick the next day. Whatever was happening, I wasn't ready to face it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the kind of thing I could avoid forever. And judging by the whispers, neither could they. Taking the day off didn't help. I spent the whole time in my apartment, pacing like a caged animal. I couldn't focus on anything. Not TV, not music, not even the sandwich I'd made and left untouched on the counter. Every time I tried to distract myself, my mind wandered back to the same question. What did it mean? "You're next." The words looped in my head until they didn't even sound real anymore. But the face, his eyes, the way his mouth moved like he was still alive, that stayed with me. I couldn't convince myself I'd imagined it. It was too vivid, too real. And the worst part was, I didn't think it was over. That night, I decided to go back to work. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed answers. Whatever was happening in that prep room, I couldn't ignore it. I needed to see it again. Or maybe I just needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. When I arrived, the funeral home was dead quiet. No pun intended. Sam wasn't there, which wasn't unusual for a night shift. He preferred to handle the day work, leaving me to deal with the late-night calls. I flipped on the lights, the hum of the fluorescents filling the silence, and headed straight for the prep room. I didn't expect the smell. Normally, the air in there was cold and sterile, with only the faintest hint of chemicals. But tonight, it was different. It was subtle at first, a faint metallic tang that reminded me of pennies. Then it grew stronger, sharper, until it was almost suffocating. It smelled like blood. I froze just outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The logical part of my brain tried to brush it off. Maybe someone had forgotten to clean up, or maybe a body had come in earlier and wasn't properly stored. But the rest of me knew better. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, at least at first glance. The gurneys were clean, the tools neatly organized on their trays, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for the body. It was the same man from the night before, still lying on the table where I'd left him. His eyes were closed now, his face slack and lifeless. But there was something off about the way he was lying there, like he'd been moved. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The metallic smell grew stronger with every step, clinging to the back of my throat. When I reached the table, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a small piece of paper tucked under his hand. With trembling fingers, I slid it free and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost childlike, but I recognized it instantly. It was mine. The note read, "Don't let them in." I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. I didn't write this. At least, I didn't remember writing it, but there was no denying that the handwriting was mine. The loops on the D, the way the T slanted slightly to the left, it was identical. My stomach churned, a sickening mix of fear and confusion twisting in my gut. I looked back at the body, half expecting him to sit up and finish what he'd started. But he didn't move. He just lay there, still and silent. Then the lights flickered. It was just a brief flicker, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick and oppressive, like I was standing in the middle of a storm. I backed away from the table, my pulse racing, and reached for the door. That's when I heard it. A faint, raspy whisper. "Alex!" I froze, my hand on the door handle. The voice was soft, almost a sigh, but it cut through the silence like a blade. It wasn't just a whisper, it was my name. And it wasn't coming from the body, it was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. The prep room was empty. No shadows, no movement, just the same cold, sterile space I'd been standing in. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Alex!" It was coming from the cooler. The walk-in cooler sat against the far wall, its heavy steel door sealed shut. Normally, the hum of the refrigeration system was a comforting background noise, a constant reminder that everything inside was exactly where it should be. But tonight, the hum was gone. Instead, the door was rattling. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The rattling grew louder, the door shaking violently on its hinges. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to get out. The whisper came again, muffled now, but still clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Alex, help me." I wanted to run. I wanted to throw open the door and get as far away from that place as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Then, with a deafening clang, the cooler door flew open. The light inside flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. For a moment I thought it was empty, but then I saw it. A figure, hunched and trembling, its back to me. It was wearing a hospital gown, its thin, bony arms hanging limply at its sides. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just stood there, my heart hammering in my chest as the figure slowly turned. Its face was wrong. The features were blurred, like a photograph smudged beyond recognition. But its eyes were clear, sharp and piercing, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You have to stop them," it said, its voice low and guttural, "before it's too late." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, the lights flickered again. When they came back on, the figure was gone. I stumbled out of the prep room, my head spinning. My legs felt like jelly, barely able to hold me up as I made my way to the break room. The air felt lighter there, less suffocating, but the words still echoed in my head. "You have to stop them." Who was I supposed to stop? What was I supposed to do? I didn't have any answers, just a growing sense of dread that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop on its own. And judging by the way the cooler door was still swinging open and closed, I didn't have much time to figure it out. The next day, I didn't tell Sam what had happened. I wanted to. I thought about it all morning, even rehearsed how I'd say it. But every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. I mean, how do you explain something like that? "Hey, Sam," one of the bodies whispered my name last night, and there was a faceless figure in the cooler telling me to stop something. Thoughts? Instead, I stayed quiet, pretending like everything was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. I couldn't stop thinking about the note. Don't let them in. Who were they? And what was the figure in the cooler trying to warn me about? By the time my shift ended, I was more exhausted than I'd ever been, but I couldn't bring myself to go home. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, so instead, I stayed after hours, waiting for everyone to leave. I had a plan, though it wasn't exactly a good one. I was going to check the records. The funeral home kept meticulous records of every body that came through. Names, causes of death, families, all neatly catalogued in black, leather-bound books stored in the office. I'd never had a reason to go through them before, but now I couldn't think of anything else. When the last staff member left for the night, I grabbed the most recent book and brought it to the break room. The pages were stiff and yellowed, filled with rows of tiny, handwritten notes. I flipped through them quickly, scanning for the names of the bodies I'd worked on over the past few nights. The first name was easy enough to find: Mark Jensen, 37, car accident. There was nothing unusual about the entry, no red flags, no extra notes. Just a name and a death. The second name was there too: Edith Harper, 76, heart failure. Again, nothing unusual. But when I looked for the third name, the man who told me I was next, the page where his record should have been was blank. I flipped back and forth, checking the dates, convinced I'd made a mistake. But I hadn't. There was a gap in the records, a 3-day stretch where no entries had been made. It didn't make sense. We never skipped days. The funeral home operated like clockwork, and every body was documented. No exceptions. My stomach twisted as a new thought crept into my mind. What if he wasn't supposed to be here? I put the book back and left the office, my heart racing. The funeral home felt different now, like the air was heavier, pressing against my chest. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was being paranoid. But as I walked past the prep room, I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The cooler door was open again. This time, it wasn't swinging or rattling. It was wide open, the light inside flickering faintly. I stood there, frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and leave. But something about the open door felt inviting, like it was daring me to look inside. I stepped closer, the sound of my own breathing deafening in the silence. When I reached the door, I peered inside, half expecting to see the faceless figure again. But the cooler was empty. I exhaled, the tension in my chest loosening slightly. But then I noticed something else. One of the gurneys was missing. There were supposed to be 3 in the cooler, neatly lined up and covered with white sheets. But now there were only 2. I checked the clipboard hanging next to the door, flipping through the intake forms. Nothing had been signed out. No removals, no transfers. The missing body was just gone. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Bodies didn't just disappear. Someone had to have moved it. But why? And more importantly, where? As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard something behind me. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across concrete. I turned, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, faint and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the direction of the chapel. The chapel was small, used mostly for intimate viewings and services. The lights were off, the room dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows. I pushed the door open cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. The pews were empty, the altar undisturbed. But as I swept the beam of light across the room, I caught a glimpse of movement near the far wall. The missing gurney was there, shoved into the corner. The sheet covering the body was askew, revealing a pale, lifeless hand dangling over the edge. My pulse quickened as I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. When I reached the gurney, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the sheet. Then, with a deep breath, I pulled it back. The body was still, its face frozen in a grimace of pain. But there was something written on its chest, scrawled in jagged crimson letters. "They're here!" I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The words glistened in the dim light, fresh and wet. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Who had done this, and why? Before I could move, the chapel door slammed shut behind me. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the faint light. I spun around, searching for the source of the noise, but the room was empty. Then I heard it again. The whisper. Alex. This time, it wasn't just a voice. It was everywhere, surrounding me, echoing off the walls. The stained glass windows rattled, the colours distorting as shadows crept across the room. The whisper grew louder, overlapping until it became a deafening roar. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the room, it was in my head. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room was silent again, the air still. But when I turned back to the gurney, the body was gone. In its place was a single blood-stained note. Don't let them take you. I left the funeral home that night and didn't look back. But as I drove home, the words echoed in my mind. A warning I couldn't ignore. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were coming. I didn't go back to work the next day, or the day after that. I told Sam I was sick, stomach bug, fever, whatever excuse came to mind. He didn't press for details, just grumbled something about kids these days before hanging up. It wasn't the first time I'd faked an illness to avoid work, but this time was different. This wasn't burnout or laziness, this was fear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words scrawled across the body's chest. They're here. The chapel door slamming shut, the shadows shifting in the moonlight. It all replayed in my head on an endless loop, and no amount of coffee or Netflix could drown it out. By the third day, I was losing it. The paranoia was eating me alive. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards in my apartment felt like a threat. I jumped at the smallest noises. A car door slamming outside, the hum of the refrigerator kicking on. I started keeping my bedroom light on at night, but even that didn't help. The darkness wasn't the problem. They were. And then the knocking started. It was just after midnight, and I was sitting on the couch, trying to convince myself to eat something. The bowl of instant ramen sat untouched on the coffee table, the steam long gone cold. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the faint hum of the streetlights outside. The first knock was soft, barely audible. I almost didn't hear it. I froze, my eyes darting to the door. It wasn't unusual for people to knock late at night, wrong apartment, drunk neighbours, that sort of thing. But something about this felt off. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. My heart raced as I stood up, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. I crept toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I reached the peephole and pressed my eye to it, expecting to see an empty hallway. But it wasn't empty. Someone was standing there. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that hung loosely on his thin frame, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes were shadowed, sunken into his skull like he hadn't slept in years. He didn't move, didn't fidget or shuffle his feet. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, his hands at his sides. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking. Still no response. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he had the wrong apartment. But deep down, I knew neither of those things were true. There was something wrong about him, something that made my skin crawl. I turned off the light, hoping he'd think no one was home. But as soon as I did, the knocking started again. Knock, 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 harder this time, more insistent. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. And then he spoke. "Alex!" I froze, my entire body locked up as the sound of my name echoed through the apartment. His voice was low, gravelly, and somehow familiar, but I didn't know him. I was sure of it. "Alex," he said again, louder this time. Let me in. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. There was no way he could know my name. No way he could know I was here. Unless... The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if this was what the notes were warning me about? Don't let them in. Was he one of them? I'm calling the cops, I shouted, reaching for my phone. Silence. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, I thought he was gone. But when I looked through the peephole again, he was still there. Only now he was smiling. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the phone in my lap, waiting for the man to come back, but he didn't. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was some kind of elaborate prank, maybe one of the neighbors messing with me. But as I got up to grab a glass of water, something caught my eye. There was a piece of paper slid under my door. It was small, folded neatly in half. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, scrawled in jagged, uneven lines. We're inside. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. The windows were locked. The door was bolted. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. But the note wasn't wrong. I could feel it. It started with the shadows. At first, I thought it was the light playing tricks on me, the way the sun shifted through the blinds, casting patterns across the floor. But these shadows moved. They stretched and shifted, even when nothing else in the room was moving. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, barely more than a hum. But they grew louder, overlapping and echoing until they filled the apartment. They didn't make sense. Fragments of words and phrases all jumbled together, like a radio stuck between stations. Help us. Let them in. Don't trust them. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside my head. And then the light flickered. The apartment plunged into darkness, and for a moment, everything was silent. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavier now, colder, like something was pressing down on me. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was the same man from the hallway, his pale face and sunken eyes illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at me, his mouth curling into that same unsettling smile. "Alex," he whispered. I backed away, my legs trembling, but I didn't make it far. The shadows behind me moved, solidifying into shapes, figures, just like him, their hollow eyes watching me from every corner of the room. They were everywhere. I don't know how I got out. The next thing I remember, I was running down the street, barefoot and freezing. The early morning light just starting to creep over the horizon. My apartment was a speck in the distance, and I didn't stop until I was sure I wasn't being followed. But even now, as I sit in a cheap motel miles away, I can feel them, watching, waiting. The whispers haven't stopped. And I know the next time I hear a knock, there won't be a door strong enough to keep them out. The motel room wasn't much. Stained carpet, a bed that creaked with every breath, and wallpaper that peeled at the edges. But it felt like a sanctuary compared to my apartment. The door had 2 locks, and I'd shoved a chair under the knob for good measure. Still, I didn't feel safe. The whispers hadn't followed me here. Not yet, at least, but I could feel the weight of them, like they were hovering just beyond the walls, waiting for the right moment to seep in. I spent the first few hours trying to make sense of everything. The notes, the man at my door, the missing body from the funeral home, it all felt connected, but I couldn't piece it together. And the worst part, no one else could help me. I couldn't call the cops. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, there's a faceless man trying to get into my head." No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believed me. By nightfall, my paranoia was at an all-time high. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. I'd barricaded the windows, with the thin motel pillows, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. Deep down, I understood something I didn't want to admit. This wasn't about the door, or the locks, or the motel. They didn't need an invitation anymore. It started around midnight, the same time as always. A faint tapping sound. Not at the door, though. This time, it was coming from the mirror above the dresser. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, save for the dim orange glow of the parking lot lights streaming through the curtains. The mirror was just a rectangle of shadow, but the tapping was unmistakable. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the glass, waiting for the sound to stop. It didn't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like knuckles rapping against the other side of the mirror. My body was frozen, but my mind raced, screaming at me to do something. Turn on the light. Run. Break the damn mirror if I had to. But I couldn't. My limbs felt heavy, like I was sinking into the bed, unable to move. Then the whisper came. Alex. It wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from inside my head, like a thought that didn't belong to me. The voice was low, gravelly, and far too close. I clutched the blanket tighter, trying to block it out, but it only got louder. Look. The words sent a chill down my spine. My gaze flicked back to the mirror, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A shadow shifting in the glass, just at the edge of my vision. Look, the voice repeated, more forcefully this time. Against every instinct, I leaned forward, squinting at the dark surface. My own reflection stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed, but there was something else. Behind me, a shape, faint but unmistakable, standing in the corner of the room. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. The corner was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shape was gone. The tapping had stopped, and the room was silent again. But the unease lingered, settling in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the mirror, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. By morning, I was a wreck, my head pounding, my body aching, my nerves frayed to their breaking point. I couldn't stay here. That much was clear. If I stayed, they'd find me. And next time, I wouldn't be able to stop them. I drove aimlessly for hours, unsure of where to go. The highway stretched out in front of me, empty and endless, the asphalt shimmering in the midday heat. I thought about calling someone, Sam, my parents, anyone who might have a clue what to do. But what would I even say? I'm being hunted by shadows. They whisper my name. They know where I am. They'd hang up. Or worse, they'd send someone to find me, and then I'd be stuck in a hospital room with no way to keep them out. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I pulled into a gas station to fill up. The place was deserted, the kind of rundown stop you only see in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car, the dry wind whipping at my face, and headed inside to pay. That's when I saw it. The clerk was staring at me. At first, I thought it was just small-town curiosity, a stranger passing through. But the look in his eyes was different. His pupils were too small, his gaze too sharp, like he was seeing something he shouldn't be able to. "You're Alex, right?" he said. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my hand halfway to my wallet. "How do you know that?" His lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They told me." My stomach dropped. "Who?" The smile widened. "You'll see." I bolted back to my car, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. The clerk didn't follow. He just stood there, watching me through the dusty glass of the gas station window, that same unnerving smile plastered across his face. I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped back onto the highway. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep the car steady. The sun was setting now, the sky fading from orange to deep purple, and the shadows along the road seemed to stretch longer with every passing mile. Then the headlights flickered. For a split second, the road in front of me disappeared, swallowed by darkness. When the lights came back on, I wasn't alone. Figures lined the sides of the highway, their pale faces and hollow eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. They didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching as I drove past. My pulse raced as I gripped the wheel tighter, my foot pressing harder on the gas. The figures grew denser, closer together, until they weren't just on the sides of the road, they were in the middle of it. I swerved to avoid them, the car veering wildly as they stepped into the headlights. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like they knew I couldn't escape. The last thing I saw before the car spun out of control was one of them standing directly in front of me, its blank face inches from the windshield. When I woke up, the car was still. The engine had died, and the air around me was deathly silent. I looked up, my head throbbing, and saw them. Dozens of them. Standing in a circle around the car, their faces blank, their bodies unnaturally still. The whispers started again, faint and overlapping, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "Come with us." I reached for the door handle, but my hand wouldn't move. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating, like it was pressing me into the seat. The whispers grew louder, filling my head, drowning out every other thought. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they stopped. The figures were gone. The road was empty, but as I looked around, gasping for air, I saw it. A single piece of paper, folded neatly on the dashboard. I unfolded it with trembling hands, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words. "It's your turn now." I'm a security guard for a billionaire's estate. I found a secret room full of lifelike mannequins. Each one looks exactly like a former employee. Working security wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills. I'd done it all: malls, office buildings, warehouses. Most of the time, the job was just sitting around, drinking coffee, and pretending to care about the monitors in front of me. That's why I didn't think twice when I got the call to work as a security guard for some billionaire's private estate. The estate was massive. Think Bond villain lair meets luxury resort. The main house was a modern fortress, all sleek glass and sharp angles, sitting on about 200 acres of forested land. There was a guest house, a pool, a helipad, and even a small lake. The place screamed money. When I arrived for my first shift, I was greeted by a guy named Brian, the head of security. He was in his early 40s, built like a tank, and had that no-nonsense military vibe. After a quick handshake, he laid down the rules. "Rule 1, he said, "you follow the schedule. Patrol routes are set for a reason. Don't deviate, don't cut corners." Seemed fair enough. "Rule 2, you see anything unusual, you report it immediately. I don't care if it's a broken light or a raccoon in the trash." "Got it." I nodded, wondering why he seemed so tense. "And Rule 3, he said, lowering his voice. "Stay out of the basement level." That one caught my attention. "Why?" I asked. He gave me a look, the kind that shuts down any further questions. "It's off limits, no exceptions." The first few nights were uneventful. My shifts were mostly spent walking the perimeter, checking doors, and keeping an eye on the camera feeds in the control room. The estate was eerily quiet at night, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise. I'll admit, the basement thing gnawed at me a bit. The cameras didn't cover that area, and the only way down was through a locked door at the end of a long hallway. Every time I passed it, I felt this weird, heavy stillness in the air, like the hallway itself didn't want me there. But I followed the rules. I needed the job, and the pay was too good to mess it up. It wasn't until my third week that things started getting strange. I was on a late-night patrol, walking past the guest house, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. One of the lights inside flickered on, then off. Anyone in there? I called out, shining my flashlight toward the windows. No response. I radioed it in to Brian, who told me to check it out. It's probably nothing, he said. The wiring in that place is old. The guest house was small compared to the main estate, but still bigger than anything I'd ever lived in. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the whole place smelled faintly of dust and cleaning supplies. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Nothing seemed out of place, until I reached the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a single glass of water. The condensation on the outside of the glass told me it hadn't been sitting there long. I reported it to Brian, but he brushed it off. Could have been one of the cleaning staff, he said. Don't lose sleep over it. Still, it bugged me. Something about it didn't feel right. That's when I started noticing other little things. The gate to the garden would be unlatched, even though I'd locked it earlier. Footprints would appear on the path leading to the lake, too small to be Brian's or mine. And sometimes late at night, I'd hear faint tapping sounds like someone knocking softly on the glass walls of the main house. I'd check the cameras, but there was never anything there. One night, I was sitting in the control room, staring at the monitors, when I noticed something strange. One of the cameras near the guest house was glitching, static cutting in and out. Then, just for a moment, the feed came back, and I saw her. A woman, standing perfectly still in the middle of the garden, wearing a long white dress. Her face was turned toward the camera, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to make out her features. I blinked, and she was gone. I replayed the footage, but the glitch had wiped it clean. All I could think about was the glass of water, the footprints, the tapping. The next day, I finally asked Brian about the estate's history. This place ever have problems? I said, trying to sound casual. He gave me a hard look. What kind of problems? I don't know, weird stuff like paranormal or whatever. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Let me give you some advice. Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said, or didn't say. The basement door felt like it was calling to me, daring me to find out what was behind it. So, against every instinct I had, I decided to break Rule 3. It was past midnight when I made my move. Brian was off-site, and the other guard was out patrolling the perimeter. I grabbed the spare keyring from the control room and made my way to the basement door. The key slid into the lock with a quiet click, and the door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. The air was cold and damp, and each step echoed loudly, like the space was far bigger than it should have been. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a long corridor lined with heavy metal doors, each one padlocked. I tried the first door, but the lock wouldn't budge. Same with the second. It wasn't until I reached the third door that I noticed something odd. The lock was broken, the chain hanging loosely from the handle. I pushed the door open, and my flashlight illuminated the room inside. It was small, no bigger than a storage closet, and completely empty, except for the mannequin. It stood in the center of the room, lifelike and unsettlingly detailed. The hair, the skin, even the faint veins beneath the surface. It all looked real, too real, and the face was familiar. It was Chris, the guard who'd worked the shift before me, the one who'd quit without warning 3 weeks ago. Or at least, that's what I'd been told. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw the mannequin move. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me. Whatever was going on in that basement, I wanted no part of it. But deep down, I knew I wasn't getting out of this unscathed. Something about the mannequin's eyes. They weren't just staring, they were watching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the control room, staring at the monitors, replaying the footage from the hallway near the basement door. I don't know what I was looking for. Proof, maybe, or some explanation that didn't involve lifelike mannequins in locked rooms. But the cameras didn't show anything out of the ordinary. The hallway was still, empty, exactly as it always looked. and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Brian was back, and I didn't want to give him any reason to suspect I'd broken the rules. But he must have noticed something off, because halfway through the shift, he cornered me in the garage. "You look like hell," he said, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Didn't sleep much," I mumbled, hoping he'd let it go. He didn't. "Something you want to tell me?" I hesitated. Brian wasn't the kind of guy you could read easily. He had that blank, unshakable stare, like nothing surprised him. I wanted to tell him everything about the broken lock, the mannequin, the way it looked like Chris, but I knew how it would sound. "No," I lied. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Keep it that way." He pushed off the wall and walked away, leaving me standing there, my chest tight with a mix of fear and guilt. That night, the estate felt different. The air was heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. I was patrolling near the guest house when I saw it again. The flicker of a light, just for a moment, in one of the upstairs windows. This time, I didn't call it in. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air smelled stale, like the room hadn't been aired out in years. I reached the hallway where I'd seen the light and found the door slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open as I pushed it, revealing a bedroom that was completely empty, except for a single chair in the center of the room. Sitting on the chair was another mannequin. I froze, my flashlight shaking as I stared at it. This one was a woman, her face serene, her hands resting delicately on her lap. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They were glassy and lifeless. But as I moved the flashlight, I realized they were following me. No, not following me, watching me. Every hair on my body stood on end as I took a step back. And then I noticed the plaque. It was small, nailed to the back of the chair, and when I leaned closer to read it, my blood ran cold. Maria Stevens, housekeeping, 2021 to 2023. Maria, she'd been one of the cleaning staff, quiet, polite, always with a smile. I hadn't seen her in weeks, but I'd assumed she'd quit. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing as I radioed Brian. "Something's wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "In the guest house. Upstairs." There was a long pause before his voice crackled through the radio. "Leave it alone," he said, his tone flat. "What? Brian, there's—" I said, "Leave it alone!" The radio clicked off, leaving me standing there, my mind racing. I didn't go back to the guest house. I didn't even finish my patrol. I went straight to the control room and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the employee roster on the estate's internal system. It wasn't something I was supposed to have access to, but I'd figured out the password on my first week. Brian wasn't exactly creative. I scrolled through the list of names, my stomach churning as I recognized more than a few of them. Chris Johnson. Security, 2020 to 2023. Maria Stevens, housekeeping, 2021 to 2023. Edward Kim, groundskeeping, 2019 to 2022. Each name had a status next to it. For most of the active employees, it said employed. For a handful of others, it said resigned or terminated. But for Chris, Maria, and Edward, it said something different. Retired. I stared at the screen, the words sinking into me like a weight. Retired, like they weren't employees anymore. But not because they'd quit. My hands moved on their own as I typed Edward's name into the system. His file popped up, showing a photo of him smiling in front of the estate's garden. But it wasn't just a photo. There was an attached document, marked confidential. I clicked it, my heart pounding as the document opened. The first line sent chills down my spine. Phase complete. Subject transferred to collection. I didn't get the chance to read more. The screen went black, and a single message appeared in red text. Unauthorized access detected. Report to the head of security immediately. Before I could react, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, staring at the monitor, hoping, praying it was just Brian. But the knock came again, louder this time. "Open up," a voice said, low and calm. It wasn't Brian. It wasn't anyone I recognized. I backed away from the desk, my hands gripping the edge as the door handle rattled, and then, through the crack beneath the door, I saw them. 2 feet, motionless, perfectly still. The same shoes I'd seen on the mannequin in the basement. "Open the door," the voice said again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle rattled one more time before the footsteps retreated, fading into silence. I waited, heart pounding, until I was sure they were gone. But when I turned back to the monitors, one of the cameras was glitching again. This time, the feed was from the basement. And standing in the middle of the hallway, staring directly into the camera, was Chris, or whatever was left of him. Chris, or what looked like Chris, was staring directly at the camera. His face was blank, unnaturally calm, but his eyes weren't right. They had that same glassy, lifeless look as the mannequins. I froze, watching the monitor as he stood motionless in the basement hallway. Then, slowly, he turned and started walking toward the stairwell, the only exit from the basement, toward me. I grabbed the radio, my hands trembling. "Brian," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's someone in the basement. It's Chris." There was a pause, and then Brian's voice came through, cold and clipped. "Stay where you are." "What the hell is going on?" I hissed, but the radio was already dead. I couldn't stay in the control room, not with whatever that thing was moving closer. I grabbed the spare keyring and slipped out, keeping low and moving fast. The estate was massive, and there were plenty of places to hide if I needed to. I ended up in the garden, crouched behind a stone bench near the greenhouse. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I'd seen. The mannequins, the employee files, the locked doors in the basement. None of it made sense. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just some weird art collection or eccentric hobby. It was something much worse. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer with every step. I pressed myself against the bench, holding my breath as the footsteps stopped just a few feet away. "Come out," a voice said. It wasn't Brian. I peeked around the edge of the bench, my heart hammering in my chest. Standing there, illuminated by the faint glow of the garden lights, was Maria. Or at least, it was something that looked like Maria. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Her head tilted slightly, her glassy eyes scanning the garden. "I know you're here," she said, her voice hollow and mechanical. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stay as still as possible. But then her head snapped toward me, as if she could sense me hiding. Before she could take another step, the radio crackled to life in my pocket. "Get to the gate," Brian's voice barked. "Now!" Maria's head twisted at an impossible angle, her eyes locking onto mine. I ran. I didn't look back. I tore through the garden, the gravel flying beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the main gate. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, heavy, unrelenting, like they weren't just running, but chasing. When I reached the gate, Brian was already there, holding it open. His face was grim, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his hip. "Move!" he shouted, waving me through. The second I was outside, he slammed the gate shut, locking it with a heavy chain. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, doubling over to catch my breath. Brian didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed me by the arm and dragged me toward the small guard shack near the gate. Inside, he locked the door and turned to face me. "You went into the basement, didn't you?" I hesitated, but there was no point lying. "Yeah, I did," he swore under his breath, pacing the small room. "You weren't supposed to see that, none of it." "See what? What's going on here, Brian?" "Those things. They're not human. They used to be," he said quietly. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "This place. It's not just an estate. It's a project. The boss, he's got money, power, connections. He collects people, employees, contractors, anyone who steps out of line or knows too much. They don't leave. They get turned into mannequins," I whispered, the realization hitting me all at once. Brian nodded. "They're not just lifelike. They're alive. Or something close to it. He calls it preservation." "That's insane," I said, my voice shaking. "Welcome to the club," Brian muttered. Before I could respond, the lights in the shack flickered and went out. "Stay here," Brian ordered, pulling his gun and stepping outside. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the knife I'd taken earlier. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the shack. "Brian!" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Chris, his glassy eyes fixed on me. Behind him, I could see Maria and another figure, a tall man in a groundskeeper's uniform. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. And then, in unison, they stepped inside. I swung the knife wildly, but they didn't flinch. Their movements were stiff but precise, their hands reaching out to grab me. I screamed, kicking and thrashing as they closed in. Their grip was cold, unnaturally strong, and I could feel myself being dragged toward the door. Outside, the estate loomed, dark and silent. And in the distance, at the edge of the forest, I saw it. A row of mannequins, standing perfectly still, their glassy eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. They were waiting, and one of them looked exactly like me. I don't know how I escaped. 1 second, I was being dragged toward the door by Chris and Maria, their glassy eyes locking me in place like I was being pulled by invisible strings. The next, I was outside the guard shack, gasping for air, the night pressing in around me. Brian was gone. The door to the shack was wide open, but the inside was empty. No mannequins, no sign of a struggle, just the faint metallic smell of blood lingering in the air. I stumbled back, trying to piece together what had just happened. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. My head throbbed, a dull ache that made every thought feel sluggish. The forest stretched out before me, and in the distance, the row of mannequins stood perfectly still. There had to be a dozen of them, maybe more, their forms barely visible in the pale moonlight. And then, slowly, one of them moved. I don't know what possessed me to go toward them. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or the sheer disbelief that this was actually happening. But I started walking, each step crunching against the gravel as I approached the line of figures. The closer I got, the more wrong they looked. Their faces weren't just detailed, they were perfect. Too perfect. Every line, every freckle, every detail down to the pores in their skin was flawless, as if someone had frozen a moment in time and encased it in wax. But their eyes were alive. Not moving, not blinking, but alive in a way that made my stomach churn. I could feel them staring at me, boring into my skull, following every movement I made. I stopped a few feet away, my breath catching as I recognized one of them. It was Edward, the groundskeeper. He stood in the middle of the row, his hands at his sides, his expression eerily calm. His uniform was pristine, and his posture was unnaturally stiff. like a mannequin in a storefront window. But it was him. There was no doubt about it. I took a step closer, my hands trembling. "Edward?" He didn't respond. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above his shoulder. And then he blinked. I stumbled back, my heart racing as Edward's head turned toward me. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was fighting against invisible chains. His mouth opened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to speak. Instead, a low, guttural whisper came out, a sound that didn't belong to anything human. "Help. Me." The words were faint, almost drowned out by the rustling of the trees, but I heard them. I turned to run, but the row of mannequins shifted. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in around me. And then I heard it, a voice, deep and commanding, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, my eyes darting through the shadows. The voice didn't come from the mannequins. It came from somewhere deeper, farther into the forest. I hesitated, torn between running back to the estate and following the voice. But something about the tone, the weight of it, compelled me forward. The path twisted and turned, the trees pressing closer with every step. The air grew damp, the ground soft beneath my feet. And then I saw it, a clearing, illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. In the center stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, draped in a long black coat that seemed to shimmer in the light. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, the faint glow catching the edges of his features. "I'm the one who keeps this place in order." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean? What's going on here? Those things, those people, what are they?" He stepped closer, his movements fluid and deliberate. "They're mine," he said simply. "Preserved. Perfected. They serve a purpose now, something greater than what they were before." "Preserved?" I spat, anger bubbling up through my fear. "You're turning them into things. They're still alive." "Alive?" he repeated, almost amused. "Do you think they were truly alive before, wasting their lives away on meaningless tasks? I've given them something eternal, something beautiful." "You're insane," I said, backing away. He raised a hand, and the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest like a vice. "You've seen too much," he said. "You were warned. The basement was not for you." I struggled to breathe, my vision blurring as the weight pressed harder. "Why, me?" I managed to choke out. He tilted his head again, almost as if he were curious. "You were chosen the moment you stepped onto the grounds, a new addition to the collection." I don't know where the strength came from, but I bolted. The weight lifted just enough for me to move, and I ran, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, slow, steady, unhurried. The mannequins were moving now, their glassy eyes turning toward me as I sprinted past them. I didn't stop until I reached the main gate, fumbling with the chain until it came loose. I threw it open and stumbled onto the road, collapsing in the dirt as the night swallowed the estate behind me. When I finally looked back, the gate was closed. The lights of the estate were dark, the forest silent. I don't know how long I sat there, gasping for air, my mind racing with everything I'd seen. But as I got to my feet, something caught my eye. A single mannequin, standing just inside the gate. It was wearing my uniform, and it was smiling. I didn't stop running. I don't remember how far I went, just that I kept going until the estate and its cursed gate were nothing but a memory swallowed by the night. The road stretched on endlessly, and with every step, I half expected to feel glassy eyes boring into the back of my head. But there was nothing, just the darkness, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. and the cold night air biting at my skin. By the time I reached the nearest gas station, my body felt like it had been through a war. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too sterile. The cashier looked up from his magazine, raising an eyebrow as I stumbled in, dirt-streaked and trembling. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice cutting through the fog in my head. I didn't answer. My mouth was dry, my mind racing with everything I'd seen. Instead, I went straight to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The fluorescent light flickered as I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake the feeling that I was still being watched. My reflection stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed, looking every bit as haunted as I felt.